Thank you, Daisy. So we're here with Barnaby Drabble. And
Hello.
Barnaby, where are you exactly?
I'm in the Alps in Switzerland.
What part of the Alps?
I'm in a small town called Sierre, which is close to the capital of the valley.
Which valley?
Well, the valley is the long, sweeping valley which runs through the Alps on reaching the border with Italy.
Sorry,
So we're in the
Italian
very,
Swiss-
very south of Switzerland. Yeah.
Okay. And Jean, you are in Baton Rouge, I assume.
Yes, cold Baton Rouge.
Yeah. And Jim is in Boulder.
Colder.
And I'm sorry,
Colder.
Boulder. Boulder
Colder
and
and-
colder.
We had 2 feet of snow last week, and it's still huge piles all over the place. So,
Oh, I envy you. I'm a great fan of snow.
oh, well, you would have loved this.
I would have. You don't sound thrilled.
I had to shovel it.
Well, the reason I asked Barnaby to join us today is he's just published this book, Along Ecological Lines, Contemporary Art and Climate Crisis. He's a new member of the EcoArt Dialogue, which Jean is also a member of. And Jim is way too busy for me to even consider inviting to be part of.
Thank you.
And, and what's interesting, there are a number of things that are interesting to me about Barnaby's book that I thought would be interesting to discuss between us, is that he has focused on artwork in the UK and in Europe. And he described, I'm sorry, what?
I was just agreeing with you, I think.
And he culled those artists from a bicycle trip that he took across the continent. And he talked with a lot of people. And one of the structural things that I find really interesting about the book, and I'd like to go into in a bit more depth, is rather than simply asking each artist to write an essay or to have an interview with each artist, relatively inconsistently, he has the artist write an essay, he does an interview with the artist, and then, for example, in the case of Olivier Ressler, he has an art critic then write about the work. And one of the reasons I find that really interesting is that something that has been coming up in my own thinking and concerns is the tendency we have culturally to allow one person to dominate the narrative. And then we reify that reified narrative over and over and over again, regardless of some of the more subtle issues around attribution or perception or even critique. So when I see something that actually reifies the discourse around a contribution, my ears really perk up.
Can you give us an example of that, Aviva?
Yeah, of which, of how Barnaby did that?
No, of how this works or dysfunctionally works.
Oh, well, I'll give you an example from my own experience that I've been very exercised about lately. In 1972, I did a performance with Judy Chicago, Suzanne Lacey, and a woman named Sandy Orgel that has since gotten a ton of art historical attention. But at the time, although I had been working professionally as an artist for several years beforehand, specifically on the issue of rape, and that was the topic of the performance, because I was younger than Judy, and because I'm not as famous as either Judy or Suzanne, and because I had stopped directing a performance group and become a student again, the two people who are credited for that work are Judy and Suzanne. And I've been in intense conversation with two authors on that topic of this performance, because the default is give credit to whomever is most famous and forget about whomever. I mean, it happens all the time. You guys as scientists know in journals where somebody in a lab is credited for a paper because they are the director of the lab, even if the graduate student did all the work. And there's a real problem with that. And the basic problem is, I think, a culture of winner take all, regardless of how they became a winner. And the most obvious example of that right now is in our country, where we have somebody who has enormous power, has won that power by hook or by crook, and devil take the hindmost.
Okay.
Does that
Go ahead,
explain
Jim.
it?
I'm reflecting on your story of even recognizing that you were 3 women in the project.
Or
4. And what was the date of the project?
1972.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've heard these stories very much along gender lines in terms of where women artists in the 1970s were sort of no longer listed and male artists listed. So for me, it's an additional story to hear that it doesn't just work along lines of gender, but also along lines of fame or visibility.
Absolutely. As far as I can tell, it works. I mean, there's the famous example with Francis Crick. But aside from that, I think generally, whether it's male or female, the cultural attitude is that women are a resource to be exploited. And women do it, and feminist women do it as much as any man. And one of the things that's really interesting to me lately in my own career is that the people taking a real serious interest in my work in the past just year or two have all been young men. So that's just kind of interesting.
So scientists often use the default as the first author. It's white at all, but if I pick on Jim, but the other authors are left off, and they end up identifying that as shorthand for the whole article. And it doesn't matter how many authors are there afterwards, whether they're alphabetical or any other order, it ends up being identified as the first author, period, for the most part. There was an effort in science circles when I came up to have a group name. This is out of the Netherlands. They had a group name, and they identified the group in some way that was neutral for the individuals. And that didn't go anywhere because the system was set up to identify merit by individual basis, not a group basis.
It's very interesting for me as well, because it's something which happens to collaborative groups in the arts as well, which is that they become less visible because there's no singular author. And it's often interesting to see also how sometimes collaborative groups, after they finish the one of the single members who becomes the most famous, the work then becomes attributed to them in hindsight. So I totally hear what Aviva's saying. I'm interested to hear that there's parallels in the hard sciences where I thought that things were more transparent. The art world is famously flexible on issues of power, and I mean, for me, it's so deregulated at times. It's really quite shocking what I encounter. But it sounds like maybe my idea of the sciences is a bit naive.
Well, there's an African proverb that's something like, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go with a group.
Mm-hmm.
So, this science academic setting is to set up things quickly and not to take the long view unless you instructively, intentionally. And the analysis are getting to show that in terms of the progress of that's made at times, and not at times, the progress that is made. Groups go further, but they don't go as quickly.
Well, the question is whether they go at all, really. I mean, If Barnaby, in your introduction to your book, you talked at length about the relationship between capitalism and what I always refer to as ecocide or eco-suicide.
Mm.
And how do you tease apart a system that will only reward the winner take all, the alpha, whoever it is, or whatever it is, from how we are self-destructing? And again, to me, it gets really complicated. I always come back to animal behavioralism, that you have so many animal studies where the alpha male takes all, or occasionally the alpha female takes all. But I don't see, and this is why I was so interested in the conversational format in your book, I don't see how we can solve the kinds of problems we have now. And Jean, your reference to going slowly but going forward, I think is really apt, that somehow we have to figure out how to be fair and inclusive, or we won't survive. I don't see how we're going to survive. Maybe a few will. A relative handful of people will survive what's going on right now.
So we do have some tools for that are, you could see, and I'm going to use the animal analogy that you brought up. If you have a chimpanzee do something they're going to get a reward for, and they get 2 bananas, and then the reward system going on gets 1 banana, he doesn't like it.
Right.
They'll refuse the banana because they understand there's an unequal treatment right in front of you. And dogs can do the same thing. So we have these kind of embedded tensions to exploit and to cooperate, that are there. We just are out. The behaviors are not always, one way or the other, but we know how they are now. So.
I could talk a little bit about the introduction to the book, and then
Please
this question of the of capitalism. I mean, I was really referring to this popular book written by Naomi Klein called "This Changes Everything." And I mean, the reason to refer to that is because it's quite familiar to a broad number of people, but actually not many people have read the whole book. But she works with a very simple sort of pointer to really explore how the basis of the capitalist system, if we really take it as in its most general form, looks for growth, without limits, and therefore, in a limited planet, we have a real problem. And then later in the book, she really starts to visit those people who argue for growth, whatever the consequences, because of the benefits which it gives them. So she's sort of, in a way, precursing the whole sort of 1% question, or these whole issues of who are these people who, in a way, are so addicted to extractivism that we can't really get beyond that paradigm. And what I'm trying to set up in that is a question about how people involved in the arts relate to that bind. I mean, the idea that culture can have an effect on the financial and economic framework upon which our entire contemporary society is built seems to me to be a very big ask. So for me, I was trying to sort of think about in what ways the production of artists, and in this case, all of them are visual artists who I look at in the book, can in any way reframe that question about living, how we live, how we want to live, and sort of in a way enter into a kind of a grassroots space of considering what we would do alternatively if we could. And as you mentioned, I kind of look at these different artistic positions from various viewpoints, from the artist's point of view about what they're doing themselves, and then also encouraging and republishing some texts which have been written about their work, and also looking at specific case studies of their work to give people an actual insight into how their projects look and how publics come in contact with their work. And that multiplicity of viewpoints, or that sort of going in depth and from different angles towards work, was important for me not necessarily because of this debate around attribution, but more because I feel at the moment a lot of stuff is published which very much skates along the surface. So we don't really get into artist practices. We get a lot of stuff on different works. And I have a background in curating exhibitions, and I was always frustrated by these kind of potpourri of interesting illustrations, which we find in some exhibitions. And what I found much more interesting was really talking to artists about how they live and work. And this was also my reason to jump on my folding bicycle and get myself around Europe and talk to these people in their homes. You know, having made the effort to come and find them, which gave also in a certain way conditions the kind of way we talk to one another about what it is to live and what it is to know things and to talk about knowledge. Yeah.
So I want to address something that I've been giving a lot of thought to, that your book evoked, and I think Jean and Jim might also have insights from the point of view of science about this. Are, I think, three things. First of all, how you organized your book, which again, I think is really interesting from the point of view of discourse and the role of discourse in getting us out of the mess we're in. And then secondly, and this is something that's come up in, as Jean knows, we're doing an anthology of teaching ecological art out of the Eco Art Dialogue. How do you tease apart what people choose to do and their stated intentions for the impact of that work, especially when we're facing the scale of challenge that we have? And I don't remember what the third one was, so why don't we just stick with those two?
What was the second one again?
Can I say something?
What was the second one again?
What an individual chooses to do. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think artists have a hell of a lot more leeway than scientists in going on at great length about what their intentions are before they get what they've done.
I'm laughing because having worked with artists for 20 years, I often find the intentions to be wildly utopian of artists involved in socially engaged work. I mean, socially engaged art, you know, refers to that history of artists who often work with communities or often attempt to take a position within situations of social injustice and go about addressing one end of this with their work. But what I always find is whenever I talk to these artists about sort of ideas of like impact or of evidence of social change, they're immediately like, oh, no, that's not at all, you know, what I'm about. So they have these very high-fly intentions and absolutely convinced that their work's socially important. But unlike many other research projects or other you know, social projects, there's no assessment at the end to actually consider whether anything was changed or not. So yeah, so it's quite a sort of a monologuing space of claims and then illustrations of claims often.
I'm thinking of, well, the person I was corresponding with this morning was Nancy Pensenthal, and one of the things that she commented was, and other people like Vivian Fried, was that they used as sources the books that artists wrote about their own work. And I thought, how effing naive can you be to use somebody's account of who and what they are and what they've done as a credible resource for who and what they've done? I mean, it's effing stupid, honestly. But what it made me think about was Bob Costanza, who did such really important work about environmental economics. And I don't know, maybe Jean, do you know very much about people who did that kind of research before Bob? or since. I haven't seen very much of him in the past few years. Do either of you know what's going on with him?
I
Well,
don't.
he's in Australia and now is an Australian citizen.
I know that. Lucky him.
Still running the same line of general ecological economics. He came out of Howard T. Odom's, he was a student, I guess, at Florida, and came where I am now. And Herman Daly was here then, and he also did steady state economics. And they were constantly trying to meld the kind of, well, they showed how the shortcoming of strictly dollar amount analysis that was still on taking control of the world was a poor representation of the total value of systems. And even sometimes expressing it as a dollar value was fraught with problems, but you had to do that sometimes to get people's attention, to which they did and are still doing in many ways. So that you say natural systems have so many, what it's evolved into, not solely from him, is ecosystem services has come out of that. And the language of that is often expressed as dollars, just as Bob was doing originally. But it wasn't, the way he started out was not dollars servicing, but what he called the embodied energy of what it took to build that up. So it takes a lot to build civilization up, for example, but you can lose it quickly. So you have this embodied energy that's accumulated over centuries or whatever. And you can have that in all other kinds of businesses, academics, and they can be lost quickly, of course. So you burn them, it's the vanity of the bonfires. And then you lose everything. Or lose certain things, and maybe you have a restoration of a different kind. But so far, that's where he is still. He's still writing good stuff, I think.
I haven't seen anything that he's written recently, but I do know that a lot of people have been talking and writing about this idea that we don't accurately value what we use from the natural world. And of course, it's a very important idea. But did he originate that idea? I don't see him credited all that much in the past, maybe 5 to 10 years.
Well, he's I don't want to use the word wrongly, but he's pretty aggressive about putting things out in the best journals he can find and drawing attention. And then, as somebody said, he builds as many bridges as he burns behind him. But he's still doing stuff on a grand scale.
Oh, good for him. Jim, do you know him?
Do I know him?
Yeah.
No.
But you must know his work.
I know I think I probably met him, but I don't really know him. So.
Yeah. So one of the things I wanted to talk about was, here we are kind of all flinging our ideas and our work at the universe, while we've got this huge wall of economic political resistance. And I've got some questions, and I'm curious what Barnaby and Jim and Jean, what you all think about the difference between the strategies we're choosing on this side of the Atlantic, where we're dealing with this monster in the White House, and the strategies on the other side of the Atlantic, where you all are dealing with the chaos of Brexit.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know which is worse. They're both, I think, pretty god-awful.
That's a very depressing sentence.
It's kind of hard not to be depressed at the moment, to be honest. I mean, the great thing is I don't live in the UK. I haven't lived in the UK for 20 years. I've been based in Switzerland and Germany and Spain. But Brexit is symptomatic of something which is going on more broadly in Europe, undoubtedly. Yeah, we could talk about that. I mean, it's important. I'm not a political analyst. I'm a curator and a writer. So my knowledge entirely of what you're talking about, Aviva, is not high, but I have some points of view.
I think, and Jean, you've been privy to the ECHO dialogue for several years now, and it could be wrong, and Jim, you might have some insight into this. But my impression is that the American intelligentsia is experiencing a different kind of crisis than they're experiencing on the other side of the Atlantic, and there is much more of a sense of personal urgency to it. And therefore, for example, I think a lot more artists on our side are engaged in Extinction Rebellion, for example, and other events. On the other hand, of course, as you chronicled, Barnaby, there's so many people did things against BP with the Tate and so on. So I'm not sure whether there's a qualitative difference or not. I'm curious whether any of you have something to say about that.
Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting thought. I do think that there's some parallels between the political changes on this side of the Atlantic and on the other side of the Atlantic, or on both sides of the Atlantic. You know, it's we've talked about this before, but I find it really surprising the depth of feeling in some people's minds and their really willingness to cling to both people and ideas that are demonstrably wrong and wrong-headed.
Stupid? Stupid?
Yeah, it's not a, no, yeah. You know, it surprises me, for example, that after, I don't know how long now, Brexit still, you know, if they had a vote on it, might actually, you know, people might vote for it again. And this is after, you know, how much time has gone by, how much, you know, analysis of the mess it would make in Ireland and the mess it would make of the British economy, you know, over and over again. And yet people are willing to ignore that and cling to the, you know, what is demonstrably false, you know, notions that people put forward around the reality of Brexit, and cling to that ideology of, you know, Britain for Britain. It's the same kind of ideology we have here in the U.S. I mean, we have, you know, I was just talking to some friends the other day, a couple of staunch Trump supporters, and they're still staunch Trump supporters. That's hard to say, which I find really remarkable. That, you know, that they're, after all the crapola that he's done, you know, all the lies and all the misogyny and all the racist comments, and you know, he's very clearly tried to use his office as a mechanism and the U.S. government as a mechanism to attack his political opponents. And it's like, I mean, wow. I mean, I can't, and yet, you know, people are willing to say that's not bad enough for impeachment. I go, well, what the fuck is? Anyway, I do think that there's some parallels there that for whatever reason, and maybe it's always been the case, but for whatever reason, people seem more than happy to cling to some pretty tenuous and if not self-destructive kind of ideas and behaviors. It seems to happen everywhere. But the two clear examples of the ones, Aviva, that you've mentioned here, the Trump phenomenon and Brexit.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody living in mainland Europe, one might also really look at the growth of two things in elections Europe-wide at the moment. On the one hand, the growth of the importance of the Green parties, only outstretched by the growth of the right wing, radical right wing parties. So democracy is undergoing a kind of it's broadening at the moment. We went through periods in the 1990s and the first 10 years of this century in Europe where, in fact, the argument was we can't tell the difference between the left and the right anymore. They're all, mainstream, middle of the road, neoliberal. And we're actually seeing an enormous fragmentation of that now, and much, much more extreme versions of the left as well as the right. From Syriza in Greece, and anti-austerity parties, which are really looking at sort of like, radical socialism. I mean, there hasn't been a Labour Party in the UK with as radical an agenda as that of Corbyn's Labour Party for decades. I mean, it looks completely far from Tony Blair's kind of middle way politics. So it's really interesting. We're seeing a growing diversity, and that's been happening over the last 10 years, not only in the UK but really across the field. But the where I would come in again on your point, Jim, is it's remarkable how many people are choosing the way of the far right. I mean, Europe, and I mean, I live in Germany, has a history in regards to the far right, and it's not that long ago, and it's really quite shocking to see, intellectuals writing, "Hey, are we repeating something here?" I mean, many of the values, the anti-immigration values, the anti-diversity values, the racist language, and the nationalism, a really unreconstructed nationalism, which has built an idea of a nation state, which is made up of the people who, belong there, and everybody else is guests, I mean, this is coming right back into political discourse. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, this would have been laughed out. I mean, this would have been like, you can't talk like that. I mean, so the whole idea of political correctness is out of the window, much in the way as it is in the States, where Trump seems to win votes and interest and attention by being deliberately politically incorrect and provocative, and so for me, I mean, one of the questions really is, what is democratic politics today in Europe? And what's very interesting, for example, with Extinction Rebellion, which was formed by a group of 100 academics from the UK, is that one of their 5 aims, I think, is to call into being these people's assemblies, which within all constitutions in Europe, there is something similar, which is to suggest that a democratic state can call into existence people's assemblies who essentially advise the politicians where there seems to be a space where there needs to be more knowledge. And I was looking at this and thinking, why is this even possible? But recently I've been in touch with groups in the UK and groups in Germany who are not only seeing it as possible, but are beginning to build these groups and beginning to legislate for these groups within local politics and national politics, which I find very, very interesting, because this is a kind of grassroots space which is being developed really around the questions of addressing climate change. And it's not uninteresting. It's operating within the state itself, so it's operating within the remits of the state, and it's not an activist body so much as a political advisory body. So it's I mean, there's a lot of people talking about democracy here in a critical way, and taking steps to try to build something from the ground up again. Because the feeling, clearly, if you look at the UK, for example, is that it's a farce. I mean, the actual politics which are going on, these people are no longer representing, their constituents. They're playing some unusual power game, and a lot of people are very, disappointed with that process.
Well, one of the things I wrote down after I went through your book last night was that it was about art at the intersection of politics and philosophy. And I thought the most interesting points that you made, and several of the writers made, although it was more implicit rather than explicit, was the role of how we structure that discourse. I think that's really, really important. And when I thought about what might make a difference these days, what I thought was, and I've come back to this over and over and over again, that conversation, the structure of discourse, and the language we use in that discourse might be the most effective levers we have right now for change.
Mhm.
And I'm curious, Jim and Jean, do you see some sort of similar pattern emerging in the sciences?
I just had a thing with my wetland class about this social trap where there's two lines of traffic opposing each other, and a mattress falls off the car or one of them. And so the first car approaching it, the mattress, it was waiting to get around it so it can go on. But meanwhile, cars are backing up, on and on and on. So the solution, which, if you bear with me, is for the person to get out of the car and move the mattress and let the traffic go that's all blocked up. And that's what discourse does. That's one thing discourse does, is to say, let's do something, or let's stop, let's have regulation, let's have, something to make us slow down and see what the real problem is. And the problem is nobody wants to bother themselves with everybody else's problem. They just want to get the car around the mattress. So if they just get out and drag it to the side, everybody goes on. So discourse does that. And I think speaking up, and you don't know if it's going to work, maybe you can't lift the mattress, I don't know, but you have to try different ways of doing it, and you don't know what's going to stick to the wall, so to speak, until you try it. So I think discourse does that. That's a really good thing to do, if that's what you're asking.
Jim, as dean at the University of Colorado, you must deal with these kinds of questions all the time. From what I understand, you're under different kinds of external pressures as well as internal pressures, especially with those students that want to go into the environmental sciences. Do you see any differences emerging about how you might be negotiating those kinds of challenges different than when you were the director of INSTAR?
Well, yes, but because as dean, I have a different and a different agenda than I had as director of INSTAR. When I was director of INSTAR, I was focused on sustainability and climate change. That was my my primary focus, because that's the focus of the Institute. As dean, I have a much broader mandate. And what I've spent my last year and a half, when I get a chance to get up on a soapbox and preach, is I talk about the value, first of all, the value of education and the need for the liberal arts. That, when the ancient Greeks first conjured up this thing called democracy, they recognized that a democratic government with an ignorant population was a train wreck. And so they said we needed everyone in our society to have a basic education in order to contribute to society. So they came up with the concept of the liberal arts, or what free people should know. That's what liberal arts means. And I think we've lost that in the last 10, 20 years. There's been a rather precipitous decline in the numbers of students who choose to major in the humanities and the arts. And that, I think, is corrosive to the soul of our societies. We have among us some tremendous artists and tremendous writers and tremendous humanists, and they're being told now, or they were being told, we're fighting back really hard, but they were being told, no, you should be a STEM major, you should be an engineer. And many of them are smart enough to do that, but that's not where their heart lies. And you know, one of the fears I have is that number one, we've lost a good chunk of our brilliant artistic minds, who are now, you know, doing calculations about, you know, bridge construction. But at the same time, we have some quite capable engineers who are miserable at what they're doing, and they're not going to succeed in life, and because they're not doing what they love to do. So that's been my big pitch. We've written many op-eds. I speak around the country on the subject that we need an educated citizenry, but we need an educated citizenry not only in the technological sense, but in the humanist sense. One of the interesting pushbacks I get is, you know, people say, well, if you don't get a STEM job, you know, your job's going to be taken away, or you're going to be redundant, or no one's going to care about you. And my pushback on them is, you know, the jobs that have been taken away in the last 20 years have been technological jobs. If a machine can do your job, a machine will do your job. But machines have yet to show anywhere near the capability that humans have of understanding humans. One of my favorite examples is why you don't have self-driving cars all over the place. So I have friends on the faculty here who 15 years ago told me that in 5 years, all cars will be self-driving cars. And the companies like Lyft and Uber will basically provide transportation for everybody. And there'll be Google cars and everything else. And if you look around, you don't see self-driving cars all over the place. And it turns out that self-driving cars need to be able to anticipate all the things that human beings do that are weird and wacky, like drive the wrong way down a one-way street, step out in the middle of traffic, all the stuff that we do, that we as human beings recognize. When we're driving in a car, we know when we see something really stupid. As a matter of fact, we steer away from that person, and we also make a mental note, that guy's an idiot. But self-driving cars don't do that. It's almost impossible for them to learn the full spectrum of craziness that human beings do when they get behind the wheel of a car. And so that's why you don't have self-driving cars now. You're not likely to have them anytime in the future. Unless one afternoon you can get all the human beings out from behind the wheel and replace everything on the highway with a self-driving car. And human beings, by the way, aren't allowed to walk near roads. It's not going to work. And it doesn't work because we have ignored our basic humanness. We've ignored that, that the thing that makes us not machines, that humanness that we have. And to me, this is the rallying cry, the battle cry that I have today, is that the loss of students in the arts and humanities, the loss of our study of ourself, is a huge mistake. Sorry, that was a long answer, but.
That was a very good answer. And it reminds me of something that was touched on in Barnaby's book about the implications of thinking in more complex ways. And what does complexity really mean? And it reminds me also of my favorite quote, I think is Theodore Roethke's. Anyway, the quote is, for every complex situation, there's a simple answer, and it's the wrong one. But
that's a nice quote.
Yeah, it really is. And that's why it's my favorite. But it seems to me that that's what everybody wants. They just want, like, climate change. Give me a simple answer. Tell me what to do. And then I don't have to worry about it or think about it. And we'll just go on as we go on.
So one of the, something I've done this past couple of weeks is work on putting together a group here at the university that's looking at sustainability and climate change, but from a much broader point of view than we ever have. And I've begun to reach out to folks in our psychology department because I didn't even know, we have folks here who study why human beings do stupid things, which I find fascinating.
Very fruitful area.
And why we do things that are obviously against our best interests. And here's another really interesting one to me, why very well educated, intelligent people will buy into the most ridiculous, Facebook theories and cling to them, even when they're smart enough to be able to sort through this pretty quickly. They've got the critical thinking skills to figure it out, but they don't. Because there's something in their head that says, no, this fits some preconceived notion I have, and so damn it, I'm going to stick with it. It's part of that humanness, part of what makes us who we are. But it's what also makes us deeply flawed. There's things about us as human beings that are just confounding, and there's some of us who go, why the hell do you do that? And others go, I do it because I can, or so whatever the answer is.
Because it's familiar.
Yeah, or because it fits, it meets a different need, right? They have this need to express something, some ethical, or even, I was about to say ethical principle, but even anti-ethical principle. But there's something about it that says, I like this, and they're willing to just completely ignore reality or accept some pretty crappy behavior on the part of some leader in order to stick with it.
Yeah. Can I respond? Jim, I'm really really aligned with what you were saying in regards to education in the humanities and the arts. And I'm somebody who's been educating artists, for the last 15 years, working in Switzerland, and then also lecturing and running workshops. And I think it's really very, very interesting to me to think what you said, which is relating this word humanities to this idea of the human. It's somehow I never made that relation, ridiculous as it is. It's there in the etymology of the term, which is exactly this possibility which artists have to spend time, often ridiculously long periods of time, on very small spaces of indication around what it is to be human. And in my book, this is what I'm trying to address after conversations with scientists who often say, well, the artist is the illustrator, is the one who represents. And I'm saying in some cases, yeah. And in fact, one of the artists who's looked at in detail in my book is the Swiss artist Marie Verlardi, who works with watercolor and represents coastlines as they change, have changed over the past millennia and will change in the future, using this unreliable paint which drips and floods across the page. But there are other artists who are not representational at all, or interested in illustrating something. And their projects are more about imaginaries, about setting up potentialities, and considering alternative parallel nows or future nows. And that's really interesting for me, because I think that belongs to somebody who ponders for long enough exactly what you're talking about, this unusualness of being human. I also recognize that I'm completely crazy sometimes, and I'm often look at myself and think, what was I thinking? Was I thinking? I don't know. And I look at the decisions I made 10 years ago, and I recognize, God, was that me, or was it another me, or which me was it? And these sort of in lack of continuity, I think, is often where artists begin their research and their work. Yeah. And I'm interested because I sense that scientists kind of, in a way, find that space of discontinuity, of complexity, as a space to try to tidy up, or to a space to try to make sense of. And I don't sense that as the activity of the artist. But maybe I'm wrong. I mean, why are scientists often so interested in the idea of the artist as the representer, or the artist is the image maker.
Infantilism. They don't want to do it themselves.
I was asking Jim and Jean, but that's maybe that's not allowed. I didn't read the rules for this particular conversation.
No rules.
Okay,
Ability.
we've heard from Aviva on this.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a common trope. Yeah. But in the book and in conversation with the David Bresch, who's a professor at the ETH in Zurich, he's a physicist. We really managed to start to find other areas where there are correlations between science and the arts, just ones which the science doesn't immediately associate with what they know about art. And these are also, tied into these questions of perception, discourse, as Aviva said, and also ideas of modeling, which comes up in a lot of sciences as well. Yeah.
Well, we have about 7 minutes left, and knowing Jim, that probably translates for him into 6 minutes.
Uh-huh.
Listen to, we beat up on Jim all the time around here, Barnaby. Don't worry.
Right. I'm just getting the hang of this. Yep.
That's because you're a resident optimist.
Yes, I am.
And the rest of us are not privy to that kind of Pollyanna world.
Well, I don't know.
The sky's always nice and beautifully blue in my world.
Lucky you. Even when it snows, huh?
Even when it's not, even when you open the garage door up and it's, more than 2 feet of snow in your driveway, and you're looking at your shovel and you're going, well, this doesn't work.
Not by itself.
Yeah, that was an interesting moment.
So Jim,
Yeah.
are you going to have an Earth Day celebration that engages some of this
Yeah.
sense of STEAM or humanities into this, the general questions people really got excited about?
Absolutely, Gene. I think we're doing a much better job of expanding the discussions.
Yeah, right.
There's you guys know this, but I spoke yesterday to a class of students who wanted to hear more about this movie that I was in, that Leonardo DiCaprio produced, Ice on Fire, because there's a farmer who I forgot what it's a southern state, Gene, but he is the one who starts talking about methane emissions from this well on his property and what that means to his kids and his grandkids. And it's something I would say, but because he is a farmer, he says it in a way that just connected with the students so much better than I do. And it's an example, I think, of who's doing the talking.
Right.
As I pointed out to them, if you want to tear into the guy, you could tear into him and say, you're not a scientist. What are you talking about? You don't know crap about methane. But he is so passionate about this and so articulate in a very plain way that I just thought it was a great example of communication done well. Sorry, I just was looking down. I got a very large bug crawling across my desk.
Oh my God.
Transported to Louisiana.
It's looking for refuge.
No. I got transported to Gene's office.
Just flick it across.
No, I didn't do that. So bugs here in Colorado got nothing on bugs in Louisiana, I can tell you that.
Sure, that's true.
Well,
Yeah. Bugs in Switzerland are very well behaved. Very
As they should be. Well, Aviva's right. I got to go. So
I'm going to send you an email about something, Jim.
what's that? Or are you just going to send me the email?
I'll
Okay.
tell you right now. I need a letter of reference for a fellowship at Harvard, the Bullard Forest thing.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Here.
Jim, it was a pleasure meeting you and
Pleasure to meet you.
Your points
And I
of view.
want to share with you my bug.
Oh yeah. Look at that one.
Delightful.
Just think,
Absolutely delightful.
Nice to meet you.
Thanks for
Um,
joining us, Jim.
I'd love to talk again. Gene, you take care, my friend.
Take care, bye.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. So now that leaves just the three of us. And there was something I wanted to bring up, and maybe in the last couple of minutes we can talk about it. It might be interesting. In your book, Barnaby, you talked about the question of how artists confront corporations. And I'm not sure exactly what state artists are in Europe these days. I'm pretty positive it's a better state than we're in here in the States. And recently, somebody reached out to me and said, I can find you a corporation that would support your project, my next project, because they want to be associated with somebody with your political views on sustainability, because they're trying to clean up their act. Well, I don't need to tell you that the alarm bells go off a little bit about greenwashing. On the other hand, as I said to him, when I was at COP15, what struck me was how many business people were there that really and truly wanted to figure out how they could have sustainable businesses. So I'm not quite sure I'm ready to dismiss all corporations and all corporate support. I wonder if you have any comments about that, or Gene, I know you've really gone through the mill on this with monitoring the Gulf of Mexico, whether you want to comment on that, but I'd be very curious about what you have to say.
Go ahead, Barnaby.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, this, to me, this question slightly correlates with what you were talking earlier about intentions and impact. I mean, there are these well-publicized and well-documented acts of divestment where cultural institutions have started to shed their sponsorship by large corporate sponsors, having come under pressure from artists and creatives who, you know, they're involved in showing or who are involved in the institutions. So that's an area where I think pressure and high visibility pressure sort of is bearing some fruit. But of course, it's like few and far between. And the divestment is one of, you know, no longer allowing this greenwashing and this sponsorship. But it doesn't stop these corporations existing or stop them finding some other area in which they're going to seek sponsorship. So realistically, how artists, you know, actually challenge corporations in terms of their climate crimes is difficult to really sort of see. I mean, one of the artists in the book is Oliver Ressler, is a filmmaker, and his way of using his art of making sort of essays, which are shown within the art world as well as within activist circles, is to follow the movements, you know, to follow the Extinction Rebellion and people blocking, you know, coal fields and to document those activities and then allow the arts circuit, if you like, to circulate this material so that people come in contact with it. So for me, that's you know, potentially another way in which particular artists are facing up against these large companies. Concretely, of course, you know, the remarkable thing is the lack of regulation of these companies by the national governments, and this is the product of a long period of neoliberalization where the governments more or less work for these companies rather than there being an idea of regulation. And there seems to be works which really are quite pessimistic. I'm thinking also about the work of John Jordan and Isabelle Fremont, where they really make these connections, and rather than seeking, you know, to change them or address them, they simply point to the ugliness and the ridiculousness, the farcical nature of attempting to use politics as a space to influence these companies. So they argue for mass civil disobedience in order to address these, and you know, basically going around the idea of requesting governments in a legal way to regulate the activities of the companies which operate within their jurisdiction. Yeah. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, somewhat. Basically, what you're saying is that it's a case by case.
Yeah, and I'd say there's a variety of different strategies which artists are using. The question comes in again back into how can we assess what really happens. I mean, the Liberate Tate incident was interesting in that eventually the Tate did shed their sponsorship from BP, which had been in the millions of pounds over the years, which BP has been sponsoring them. But even then, the Tate said, well, it wasn't the activism which actually stopped them, taking the sponsorship. So yeah, it's very, very difficult to see art in that one-to-one effectiveness in the situation we're in at the moment. It's nice to fantasize about it, though.
Yeah, I think it's always very difficult to make that linear association with art, even though artists are always pressed to make that.
They are, and I agree with you, which is I don't think that's something which we, as artists and people making projects, have to address. And I think the other thing is that there's, in all of the artists who I met, there's a great humility about this now. In the light of what's going on in the world, I don't think anybody would say, oh, I'm a planet-saving artist, or I'm. They're very, very humble around, okay, well, I'm here and I feel compelled to do something, and this is my part, rather than making great claims for their agency.
Well, I would happily own that I'm a planet-saving artist, but that doesn't mean that I'm saving the planet.
Okay.
So I'm not sure that's about humility so much as just realism. I think intentions are important, as you've said, and my intention is to save the planet. Whether I can contribute to that salvation, who the F knows? I would like to imagine that.
Yeah, I'm wondering whether there's a difference between the States and Europe in terms of also these how we state our intentions and how we tie ourselves to ideals and aims. There's a sort of modesty often in the activities of European artists, which can also sometimes be a little bit of a sort of weakness, yeah, or a sense of sort of self-fulfilling prophecies sometimes too.
I don't remember whether it was Gene or Jim recently who commented that Americans have this kind of can-do attitude. We say, oh, we're going to go do this.
Yeah, that's part of the problem.
Yeah, and of course it's part of the problem. Gene, please give me the last words.
Oh, well, well, there's two for each of you. If Viva, it doesn't matter whether it had an effect there or not, you might say, because you would be a very different person if you refused to try to do something. So that alone is worth doing something, because it would tear you apart if you didn't try to do that. That's just knowing you for a while. And Barnaby, what was I going to say? Oh, I know, the Tate Gallery. I doubt very much the next sponsor is going to be the equivalent to BP. They won't even offer. They know what would happen through the public embarrassment, and it doesn't matter what the directors say. It achieved the goal of not kind of brutalizing the point of having an art gallery by false advertisers, just creaming it. So I think it had that effect in and of itself. The next person's not going to volunteer. I mean, the equivalent BP is not going to volunteer at all. Doesn't matter with the board of directors, who will also be sensitive to that privately. But the donation's just not going to come. And if there's a failing on this, it has to be, well, what are they going to do to make up for those funds?
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole thing about Occupy museums here, especially in New York. Okay, so we get a pure as the snow group of trustees, and is there any money there?
Well, that's just a fair question, which, like a lot of revolutions, succeed, but then they fail because it's just replaced by another despotic situation. Because the point is to overthrow, it's not to replace, so the same thing come back.
Well, I think we've opened up a whole new set of cans of worms, which we're not going to close today. But thank you so much for joining us, Barnaby. Jean,
Yes.
thank you so much, as always, for being such a stalwart part of these conversations. And I hope you'll come back, Barnaby.
I'd love to. I also feel like, I mean, I've got pages of pencil notes here in front of me. Yeah, because we talked so quickly and covered such a lot of territory, and it seems like the three of you have been in dialogue quite a lot, and I'm new to this, but there's a lot of things which I'm left thinking about,
Okay.
which, you know, which is great for me, and spurs me on to think more, and maybe I would join you again, and we could talk further and try and maybe pick one of these many things we've talked about and go into a bit more detail.
Please, why don't you give us a suggestion about your favorite when you get around to it?
Okay, yeah, maybe I'll do that.
Okay. All right.
Great.
Thank you, guys. Happy
Bye-bye,
rest of the
everybody.
holidays.
Bye.
Thanks now.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.